Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Dave's Math channel. I'm your host, David Tear, and this is my continuing feature on the Math Lovers book. And since today's Saturday, like I do every Saturday, I'm featuring another biography of a famous mathematician. I have them in my book at the end of volume 2, listed chronologically. I have 80 of them altogether. And then I'm up to the 18th one, and that one happens to be René Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650. Here's a picture of him, and here's the bio I give in my book. And he was a very famous, not just a mathematician, but he was also a scientist and a great philosopher. One of my favorite philosophers, actually. He was French and he was a Renaissance man, and he was also considered one of the figures of the scientific revolution. So, pretty great guy all around. But his main contribution in mathematics was Cartesian coordinates, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. They're just nowadays they're usually called rectangular coordinates. But, when you do graphing, you probably learn them in high school when you were learning how to graph functions. You got an x-axis and a y-axis, and you can plot points in what's called the xy plane. For instance, a point 3 comma 4 would be 3 units to the right of the origin, 4 units above the origin. I think you get the idea. And you can go left, you have negative x coordinates if you're going left of the y-axis, and similarly you have negative y coordinates if you go below the x-axis. So I think you guys all learn how to do this. And it's a very powerful tool. And I think nowadays we kind of take it for granted. The thing that was really revolutionary about this, I think, is that he kind of pioneered a new field of math known as analytic geometry. I mean, basically, what he did was he converted algebraic equations into geometric equations. Because, for instance, if you look at a circle, like the unit circle, x squared plus y squared equals 1, that might not be obvious that equation represents a circle, but when you graph it, you'll see that the graph looks like a circle. So, a lot of people are more visual, and, if you graph functions, you kind of have at least, you can see what the solutions look like. You can look at the roots of polynomials, even if they're hard to calculate. So it's a very powerful tool, you know. And of course, you don't have to stop at 2 dimensions. You can go to 3 dimensions. We live in 3 dimensions. But at least abstractly, you could go to as many dimensions as you want. Even have a problem graphing 3 dimensions because you're graphing them on a 2D piece of paper. But you kind of have to imagine as 3D. That's why I use perspective. And nowadays, you can do this on the computer. You can rotate the picture. It's a lot easier to visualize 3D than it used to be. And like I said, abstractly, you can go even to higher dimensions. It's very hard, almost impossible for most people to imagine more than 3 dimensions since we only live in three. But mathematically, it makes perfect sense. And you can still use, higher dimensional analogs of Cartesian coordinates to do that. So very powerful mathematical tool. I think that in and of itself made Descartes a really outstanding mathematician. So I think that was his main contribution, actually. But another really great thing he did was, like I said, he was a really amazing philosopher. He wrote this really influential book called Descartes' Meditations. I guess the full title was Meditations of Prime Philosophy. It's in Latin. I don't know how to translate Latin because I never learned Latin. I just always learned it as Meditations. And I actually took a course when I was in college, I think my sophomore year of college, where we read Descartes' Meditations. There's 6 of them. And they're pretty powerful. I mean, what Descartes basically did in these meditations was he tried to build a framework for knowledge. Epistemology, it's called, kind of the philosophy of knowledge. How do we know what we know about the world? And he kind of starts in square one. He says, how do we even know this is the real world? How do we know we're not dreaming? How do we know we're not being deceived by an omnipotent deceiver, which nowadays I think we might think of as the Matrix, or Plato even imagined this, Plato's cave, and we all know about optical illusions. Sometimes we don't see things accurately, we don't perceive things accurately. So, he goes, and in his first meditation, he kind of comes to doubt everything he's ever, accepted before. He says our senses are unreliable. How do we know anything? But then, in the start of his second meditation, there's total six of them, by the way. In his second meditation, he says this famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." He says, even if there is an omnipotent deceiver, he can't deceive me, because he's deceiving me, which means that I cannot doubt my own existence. I think, therefore I am. I think that's very powerful. We can't doubt, according to Descartes, we cannot doubt that we exist. The very, fact that we're thinking and that we're conscious of our own existence means that we exist. So that's kind of square one. And he kind of builds from there. I mean, then he says, well, if we exist, then other people have to exist. We're perceiving them, they're perceiving us. And, I think there are some flaws in his arguments, but, that's kind of what he is in the second meditation. The third meditation actually argues for the existence of God. Not a deceiver, but a good God, a good supreme being. Maybe not exactly the God from the Bible. I do like his argument, by the way. Even now, though I'm not religious in the traditional sense, I hate the Bible. If you want to know the truth, I hate Western religion in general. I'm not religious at all in the traditional sense, but I do believe in God. I have come to believe in God. I think in a lot of the same ways as Descartes did, Descartes was what was known as a dualist. This is a very a big school of philosophy. Actually, I think Plato was also a dualist. Dualism is the idea that there's a material world and a spiritual world. And he said that we're really spirits. That was the last thing he argued with his meditations. I'm not going to go through all six of them, but by the end of his, meditations, he says, not only do I exist, but God exists, and the world exists basically the way we perceive it. And we're not material beings; we're really spiritual beings. So, I think in that sense, he was kind of like Plato. I mean, Plato kind of believed, that, the world of ideal forms, which I guess now we would call the spiritual realm, is really kind of uh, more real in a sense than the material world. The material world is kind of an approximation, or it's what we perceive, which is a pretty powerful philosophy, and I think I still kind of adhere to this philosophy, by the way. I mean, obviously, I do believe in a material world. There are some, what are called idealists, like Bishop George Berkeley, who I never liked. He was what's called an idealist, not meaning that he believed that we in a perfect world. That might be what we call an idealist today. What he believed was that the only things that exist in the universe are spirits, minds, that matter's an illusion. I don't believe that. I think that's a pretty crazy philosophy, actually. I mean, if you look at science, if you look at modern science, I think one the most basic assumption of modern science is there is a material world, because that's what science studies, the material world. So I do believe in the existence of the material world, but like Descartes, I think I also believe in a spiritual reality. And I'm what you would call a mathematical Platonist. I don't go as far as Plato. Plato thought there were ideal forms of everything, but I don't go that far. I think there's ideal mathematical forms. I think there's great ideas that we can be passed down. But I still think we live in a material world, and I guess in some sense I'm a little bit of a realist, and but anyway. So enough of that. That's a little bit of a digression. That's kind of a digression into Descartes' philosophy, but I do really like it, and that's why I mention it here. I think I want to mention one more thing about Descartes before I finished. Like I said, he was one of the key figures of the scientific revolution. I think he believed in the heliocentric model of the solar system, but he got a lot of things wrong. I think that's the last thing I'm going to say. Even though he departed from Ptolemy, he didn't believe that the Earth was the center of the universe. I think he believed the sun was the center. But he thought, that the Earth, he thought that the orbits of the planets were like orbits and vortices. He kind of imagined some kind of ethereal fluid that the planets were orbiting within, and the moon was in a ether around the Earth. He was wrong about that. And he even thought that the shape of the planets were prolate spheroids. They're not prolate, they're oblate. That means they're flat and slightly at the poles. He thought they were pulled, they were kind of egg shaped. So he's wrong about that. I don't think he did very many observations. He just kind of argued through a lot of his philosophical ideas, what he thought the solar system was like. But, he wasn't too far off. He made some good guesses. They just turned out not to be correct. But anyway, I guess that's enough said about Descartes. Like I said, one of my favorite mathematicians and philosophers. And that completes my video for today. That completes my biography of René Descartes. Thank you for watching. Long live math, and I'll see you guys next time.